Trevor Berbick's life was marked by a whirlwind of violent acts, disturbing accusations, public brawls, and startling disputes that overshadowed everything he once accomplished in the boxing ring. Although he held the WBC heavyweight title for a short time, his final years were riddled with legal problems. Allegations of sexual violence, battles with the law, and feuds that ultimately led him into a tragic demise at the hands of his own family member. His personal struggles became far more compelling than his earlier victories, and he eventually became infamous for the chaos that clung to him wherever he went. People who once admired his athletic potential later shook their heads at the endless stream of scandals emerging from every corner of his life. His story shows how quickly a talented prizefighter can derail his own life when driven by anger, suspicion, and frustration. It also underlines how certain environments and lifestyles can nurture self-destructive tendencies in someone who refuses to see his own mistakes. He showed early signs of belligerence in his interactions with fellow boxers and promoters. He often seemed convinced that those around him were conspiring to cheat him or disrespect him. That conviction poured into the ring as well, where he sometimes accused referees or opponents of wrongdoing. The more time he spent in the professional boxing circuit, the more his disputes became public knowledge, leaving managers, trainers, and fans describing him as combative and unpredictable. While some fighters in that era were known to trash talk or posture aggressively, his behavior didn't always feel like mere showmanship. He seemed genuinely embroiled in bitterness, ready to lash out and quick to claim he was being targeted. Even outside the ring, he clashed with acquaintances and family members, lashing out in frightening ways that eventually led him to the inside of a courtroom more than once. He was arrested multiple times in the United States and Canada for assault-related charges. Some reports suggested he had been involved in heated arguments that escalated into physical encounters. Others pointed to more concerning allegations of him brandishing a weapon during a dispute. One such instance involved him wielding a gun because he believed someone had taken money from him, or so the rumor went. The consequences of that incident were serious, with law enforcement stepping in to charge him with aggravated assault. He pleaded his side of the story, insisting he was simply defending himself and his livelihood. Yet such incidents piled up, painting a pattern of violent outbursts that overshadowed any attempt at redemption. Alongside these assault cases, he ended up in court for forging his ex-wife's signature on mortgage documents. This incident, which some described as blatant fraud, caused yet another wave of negative publicity. The forging of signatures for financial gain showed a willingness to cross legal lines whenever he felt it would benefit him. It also displayed his deepening disregard for rules, indicating that he believed his personal needs took precedence over anything else. At that point, the fighter who had once fought bravely on pay-per-view events was turning into a man with a rap sheet. His identity as a sports figure began colliding with his identity as an offender, as newspapers started focusing on his arrests more than his matches. His personal life was equally troubled, especially in matters of marriage and parenting. He married and divorced more than once, and many of those relationships involved accusations of threats or violence. Those close to him said he was prone to blaming others for his misfortunes. Rather than reflecting on how his outburst might drive people away, he insisted that family members were betraying him or that friends were exploiting him for money. In some ways, these attitudes fueled a cycle in which he alienated potential allies, setting the stage for fresh conflicts. He would accuse someone of wrongdoing, lash out with hostility, and then find himself contending with the authorities yet again. One of his most horrifying crimes was the sexual assault of a minor in Florida, a case that deeply tarnished whatever respect he had left in the boxing community. A teenage girl who had babysat for him came forward with the accusation, claiming that he had raped her despite her desperate attempts to flee. The trial made headlines as sports journalists scrambled to reconcile his achievements in the ring with the monstrous image that emerged in court. Jurors heard evidence that he had forced himself on this girl and then tried to deny any wrongdoing, going so far as to accuse the girl of inventing the story for attention or money. But the court found him guilty. handing down a prison sentence that confirmed his place behind bars. That conviction solidified him as a convicted felon of the worst kind in the public eye, distancing him from whatever fan base he had once attracted. That stretch in prison could have offered him a chance to reflect and change, but upon his release, he quickly resumed a life marked by more legal hurdles. There was his deportation from the United States, followed by attempts to skirt the law by sneaking back in. There were also bizarre run-ins with ex-champions, such as the time he bickered with a fellow boxer in public and ended up rolling around in a wild brawl. One particularly notorious incident involved a parking lot confrontation in which he argued loudly and refused to let the matter go, prompting his rival to lunge at him in full view of onlookers. The scuffle became a memorable piece of boxing lore. Not because it showcased two aging fighters in a sporting competition, but because it resembled a street fight between men who simply couldn't stand each other. It was a far cry from the dignity people hoped to see from any athlete who'd once worn a championship belt. Media outlets latched onto these spectacles, often describing him as an unstable force who sabotaged his own image. Where other retired athletes might have settled into coaching, commentary, or business ventures, he seemed to chase conflict and become entangled in a never-ending cycle of aggression. His presence at public events sometimes caused unease, as people worried he would erupt at the slightest provocation. The tension around him increased with each new police report, each new court case, and each new scuffle. Even those who had once believed he might stage a late career comeback began doubting whether he could function normally outside the ring. His bizarre conduct wasn't limited to physical violence. There was also the matter of fights that ended under unusual circumstances, especially the one in Japan against a wrestler where he abruptly left the ring claiming the rules had been changed without his knowledge. He appeared confused or unprepared, as if he had never bothered to understand what he was getting into. He argued with referees, signaled that his opponent was using illegal moves, and then stormed off, leaving confused spectators behind. The end result was another blow to his reputation. People called him unprofessional, incapable of handling adversity in any environment. Even if there was a legitimate misunderstanding, his dramatic exit and refusal to continue made the entire affair look like a fiasco. Once again, the narrative became that he could not go anywhere without sowing mayhem. Meanwhile, the legal troubles kept piling up, particularly after his conviction for the sexual assault. He was charged with parole violations, accused of missing hearings, and hounded by immigration authorities who wanted him out of their country. His attempts to remain in North America were consistently undermined by his record, and he struggled to find a stable home. At one point, he tried to re-establish himself in Canada, the country that had been his base when he first turned professional. But news reports surfaced that he had entered Canada on dubious terms, failing to disclose his criminal status properly. That placed him at risk of being deported, and the cycle of moving between countries continued. He also showed difficulty holding on to any earnings he had made during his prime. Lawsuits drained some of his finances, and the cost of legal representation after so many arrests created a financial burden that he couldn't handle. Interviews from that time painted him as a man who felt constantly persecuted, convinced that others were making false claims to bring him down. He told stories of how managers and promoters had cheated him out of money and insisted that everyone from law enforcement to the boxing establishment had it out for him. Even though some fighters do indeed face exploitation and tricky contract situations, observers noted that his pattern of blaming everyone else seemed more like denial than a reflection of actual events. As the decade wore on, his troubles back in Jamaica escalated. He had returned to his native country with the hope that he might restart his life away from prying American or Canadian eyes. Instead, he became embroiled in family feuds, including arguments over land rights that turned increasingly nasty. He insulted relatives, accused them of stealing, and threatened violence to get his way. The bitterness between him and some members of his extended family ran deep, with each side calling the other unreasonable. Villagers whispered about his unpredictable behavior, saying he walked the streets at night, sometimes shouting obscenities at people he believed had wronged him. Individuals who encountered him casually often recalled an uneasy feeling of tension, as though at any second he might start a confrontation. He'd attempted to re-enter the ring multiple times, but each attempt was overshadowed by a new round of scandal. Even if he scheduled a fight to chase some paycheck, the promoters faced an uphill battle trying to get him licensed, thanks to his criminal record and the swirl of negative press. The legal system weighed on him like a heavy chain, forcing him to keep track of court appointments, fines, parole conditions, and possible deportation orders. Meanwhile, some in the boxing community condemned him as a disgrace, pointing out that his presence tarnished the sport's image at a time when it was struggling to maintain credibility. He was, after all, a convicted rapist with a reputation for violence outside the ring, and that didn't sit well with fans who wanted to look up to their heroes. Even the raw excitement of heavyweight boxing couldn't wash away the stench of such serious crimes. Despite these growing troubles, he never seemed to lose the conviction that he was being persecuted unjustly. He would talk as though the entire system was rigged against him and that all these legal cases were rooted in conspiracies. He implied that his downfall began the moment he lost his world title, as if that single boxing defeat had triggered a vendetta by officials, ex-partners, and complete strangers. Yet the record of arrests and convictions made it difficult to see him as merely a victim of bad luck. Police reports from multiple jurisdictions consistently named him as the aggressor in violent disputes. Witnesses described him as confrontational and quick-tempered, and prosecutors often had strong evidence to bring him to trial. It didn't help that he seemed to show no remorse, instead lashing out at the media or attacking the credibility of his accusers. In some interviews, a glimmer of self-awareness peeked through when he spoke about regrets. He might mention missed opportunities, pointing out that if he had surrounded himself with a more stable team, or if he had listened to good advice, he wouldn't have ended up in such dire straits. But these moments of introspection never lasted long. Before anyone could see a consistent change in him, he'd erupt in another argument or commit another offense. The underlying anger in him persisted, and those who knew him well described him as a ticking time bomb who never truly learned from his mistakes. The Florida rape case is something that defined him in a dreadful way. After that conviction, everything about his public persona deteriorated further. People who tried to advocate for him found it nearly impossible to defend his actions. Even if they believed that certain aspects of his story were misunderstood, they couldn't overlook the fact that he had violated a teenage girl in a horrifying manner. Some said that, in prison, he insisted the entire thing had been fabricated by people who wanted money from him. Yet the judge and jury disagreed. The evidence was too strong, and the victim's testimony was too credible to dismiss. The result was a multi-year sentence that could have extended longer, if not for early release. By the time he walked out of prison, a large portion of the boxing community wanted nothing more to do with him. He had transitioned from champion to felon, from role model to pariah. His time in lockup did not rehabilitate him. Instead, it hardened him further, fueling his hostility toward the authorities. That hostility manifested in repeated parole violations and attempts to game the immigration system. He failed to appear for court dates, neglected to check in with parole officers, and then condemned the system when they tried to impose consequences. Whenever forced to choose between legal compliance and doing things his own way, he picked the latter, which usually led to more problems. The cycle fed itself. More animosity, more legal trouble, and more reason for him to view the world through a lens of paranoia and resentment. Some childhood acquaintances later commented that he had always harbored a deep-seated anger. They remembered how, even before his professional career, he got into fights that went beyond friendly sparring. Once he became an adult with money and a measure of fame, they claimed he lacked the discipline to manage that anger. Instead of finding healthy outlets or seeking therapy, he let the rage grow. Combined with newfound power and financial independence, that volatile personality had few boundaries. It was as though no one could tell him to slow down or reflect on his actions, not even the judicial system. The forging of documents further illustrated how brazen he could be when it came to bending rules. That case involved him attempting to secure a mortgage by forging his ex-wife's signature. When the bank discovered the discrepancy, it led to criminal charges. He defended himself by saying that he had every right to that money, that his ex-wife was refusing to cooperate, and that he simply took a shortcut because he believed the law was stacked against him. In other words, he rationalized it as a desperate move in a world that wouldn't give him a fair chance. But once again, the courts found him guilty, and the entire fiasco spilled into the media, painting him as someone who always tried to get what he wanted through force or deception. These incidents, repeated across various countries, left him a man without a stable home base. In the United States, he was a convicted rapist who had served time, and immigration officials were eager to deport him. In Canada, his presence was tenuous because of his criminal record, and the process of appealing deportations took a toll. In Jamaica, old acquaintances didn't necessarily welcome him with open arms, especially once he caused trouble within his own family. The cumulative weight of these troubles dragged him down further. He occasionally found minor boxing engagements in small venues, but the purses were modest compared to his earlier days. Sponsors and promoters avoided him, worried about the negative attention and logistical hassles that came with a fighter known more for court dates than for ring performances. His frustrations simmered with each passing year. He would give explosive interviews, blaming everyone from the judicial system to former trainers, accusing them of collaborating to ruin his reputation. His outbursts grew more conspiratorial, claiming that maybe his downfall was orchestrated by powerful people. Yet no matter how much he insisted he was a victim of schemes, the documented evidence of his misconduct kept stacking against him. He seemed unable or unwilling to break this pattern. People who might have helped him financially or legally stepped back, fearful of the liability he posed. In Jamaica, he fell into disputes with relatives over property. One of the central points of conflict was land he believed he owned outright. Other relatives asserted they had rights to that land and refused to cede it to him. He believed they were stealing from him or trying to rob him of an inheritance. He might show up at their doorstep spewing threats, refusing to negotiate calmly or settle the matter through lawful channels. At times, local authorities had to intervene, warning him that continued threats would lead to further arrests. He reportedly resented that police showed him no favoritism, despite his past achievements. The tension in the village escalated as neighbors worried about his temper, describing nights when they heard him shouting about conspiracies and vowing revenge. Some said that they avoided crossing his path, hoping to prevent a violent confrontation. If he had some sense of perspective, he might have recognized that angering half his family and community was pushing him toward an even worse fate. But his anger rarely allowed him to see the bigger picture. Instead, he was living in a state of resentment, convinced he was fighting a righteous battle against people who didn't appreciate him. He kept going to local bars, where he would sometimes drink and complain loudly to anyone who would listen. The lines between reality and paranoia became blurred, at least from the outside looking in. He insisted that people were out to get him, and the more he ranted, the more he seemed to confirm that he was beyond reason. The brutality of his murder was shocking, yet some observers felt it was the grim outcome of the path he'd been walking for years. One night, he was walking home through his parish. At some point, he encountered family members with whom he'd had ongoing disputes. The confrontation rapidly escalated, fueled by old grudges and unresolved anger. The exact details remain somewhat murky, but what is known is that a metal pipe, or a machete, was used, and he sustained fatal head injuries. Locals found him lying on the ground, beaten to death in an attack that was vicious even by the region's standard of violence. The news of his murder traveled quickly, and the media once again reported on him. Only this time, the headline was that the ex-champion had been brutally killed, allegedly by family. Police inquiries revealed that his nephew and at least one other individual were tied to the attack. They were arrested and put on trial for murder. Prosecutors laid out the argument that this was no random robbery, but rather the final step in a bitter family feud over property and long-standing grudges. Witness testimonies pointed to the nephew's anger at him for alleged mistreatment and humiliation. Others said that he had physically assaulted family members in the past, that he had threatened to kill certain relatives, and that tensions had peaked in the weeks leading up to the attack. The nephew's defense tried to paint him as someone pushed to the limit by years of aggression, though ultimately the court found no justification for murder. When news outlets started analysing the murder, many of them took a retrospective look at his life, portraying a man who had squandered enormous potential. They noted how his troubles started small, maybe a minor assault charge or argument in the ring, but escalated until he was embroiled in sexual violence, fraud, deportations, and repeated conflicts with relatives. Journalists who once covered his boxing matches recalled how at one point he was a formidable contender, strong enough to go the distance with elite fighters. Yet that once promising athlete was overshadowed by a pattern of destructive decisions. The murder thus became a shocking end to a tragic story, leaving observers to wonder if there had ever been a turning point that might have saved him from himself. Fans who remembered him from his early days were astonished to see how a once respected boxer ended up battered to death in the dark by people who shared his last name. Some asked whether his own history of violence had normalized brutality around him. creating an environment where such an ending was somehow more likely. Others expressed sadness that the only headlines he generated in his final years were tied to the worst aspects of his character. To them, it was as though the champion's spirit had died long before his body did, replaced by a hardened offender who refused to let go of anger. His funeral was not a grand celebratory affair. Though a handful of people paid their respects, the event carried a somber sense of wasted potential. Conversations among attendees circulated around the question of whether he had ever truly been happy. Had he sought any form of help for anger management or mental health concerns? Had he ever tried to reconcile with those he'd wronged? The consensus was that he burned too many bridges. By the time he returned to Jamaica, he had nowhere else to turn and no one truly left in his corner. He was adrift in a place that should have felt like home. Yet it was fraught with tension and old resentments waiting to explode. Looking back on the arc of his life, it seems that all the legal troubles, crimes, and accusations formed a continuous chain that pulled him down relentlessly. After every hearing, every sentencing, every deportation, he seemed less willing to abide by any conventional norms. That only accelerated his downfall. He had the physical power to intimidate people, and for a while, that might have worked in his favor. But intimidation can only go so far when you're constantly clashing with the law. Courts don't care how many knockouts a boxer has on his record. They only look at the facts of the case, and the facts consistently showed he engaged in violent or dishonest behavior year after year. In that sense, his life story is a warning about the dangers of unchecked aggression. Physical talent can carry an athlete to high places, but if the athlete lacks emotional regulation, a willingness to follow basic rules, or respect for others' boundaries, success can evaporate quickly. Each time he landed in court for assault or fraud, he lost more credibility. Each time he cast himself as a victim of conspiracies, he alienated potential supporters. And each time he attacked someone physically, he inched closer to a reality where the threat of violence became the language he knew best. Ultimately, that language came full circle, as violence claimed him on that dark night in Jamaica. Even when reflecting on the final days before his murder, witnesses said he seemed restless, as though he couldn't escape the turmoil he'd created. Some in the village speculated that he had threatened the wrong person one too many times. Others blamed the nephew's rage, suggesting it was he who finally snapped after years of humiliation. The trial transcripts revealed a web of anger so tangled that it almost felt inevitable something dreadful would happen. The nephew insisted that the ex-champion had bullied and assaulted him repeatedly. Whether that's true or merely a partial truth, it underscores how complicated the dynamic was. In the wake of his death, sports historians tried to reconcile the man's skill in the ring with his terrible behavior outside it. They noted how he achieved a short-lived title reign, a highlight in boxing annals. Yet, it's overshadowed by the monstrous crime of raping a teenager and the repeated aggression he displayed. As time goes on, highlight reels rarely show him, except in the context of that devastating knockout he suffered at the hands of a younger opponent, or the final fight of a legendary boxer's career. It's as though his role in the sport's history is to serve as a footnote for other, more admired champions. Then, of course, there's the lurid aspect of his murder, which draws grim fascination from people who wonder how a champion could die in such a brutal, personal manner. There's also a recurring theme in discussions about him. Was he mentally well? Had repeated blows to the head contributed to erratic behavior? Some speculate about neurological damage from his years in the ring, though that hardly excuses rape or forgery. Still, the question remains whether a different approach to mental health support for boxers might have intervened. Perhaps if he'd been screened or guided toward resources that addressed psychological struggles, parts of his tragic spiral could have been prevented, but that's all hypothetical. In the reality of his life, he showed little willingness to accept help, always blaming others for what was happening to him. The judicial system's repeated attempts to straighten him out through prison sentences, probation, and deportation simply did not steer him toward reform. Instead, these encounters might have deepened his defiance. Every prison stint or court order strengthened his perception that he was a martyr, singled out for punishment while others got away with worse behavior. His refusal to take responsibility overshadowed any hope of redemption. Family ties eroded as well, leaving him with no stable network. The final blow came from within that same fractured family, a lethal outcome that underscores how dysfunctional the relationships had become. It was not a random criminal who did him in, but people he likely knew well, reflecting a personal conflict that escalated beyond all reason. In the days after his murder, local and international headlines blared the news. Some outlets tried to sum up his life in a few paragraphs, citing his key fights and the controversies that trailed him. Comment sections were filled with a mix of disgust, pity, and relief that the story of his violence had come to an end. Some argued that no one deserved such a brutal death, regardless of their crimes, while others pointed out the poetic justice of someone so accustomed to violence meeting a violent end. The nephew's sentencing to life in prison gave a sense of closure from a legal standpoint, but morally, the entire saga felt hollow. 2 lives were essentially ruined that night, his own, which ended, and the young man's, which would be spent behind bars. The rest of the family was left to grapple with the aftermath of a killing that had grown from the seeds of long-standing resentment. Over time, the significance of his short boxing reign faded even further. Younger fans who study the history of the heavyweight division might learn his name solely in relation to certain legendary matches, without realizing how dark his personal life was. Older fans might remember that he was once decent in the ring, but quick to point out that his real legacy is one of spiraling violence and disgrace. If anything, his name arises as a cautionary tale more than an inspiration. Those who want to see how a fighter can lose his way can look to his example and see how quickly fame turns to infamy when trouble keeps knocking at the door. His downfall was so consistent, so unrelenting, that it almost overshadowed the memory of him winning the belt in the first place. Yet there's something undeniably tragic about the extremes he went to and the lonely place he found himself in the end. At one time, he believed that winning a major fight would be the key to proving himself. He did that, if only briefly, yet discovered that the real challenge was navigating the responsibilities and expectations that come with being a champion. Instead, he turned his aggression outward, injuring others and breaking the law, until the system had no choice but to keep him under constant scrutiny. His repeated breaches of trust, be it forging documents, assaulting acquaintances, or committing a horrendous act of sexual violence, made it impossible for him to hide behind the aura of a champion. And when he tried to return to Jamaica to escape the legal pressures of North America, he found that the resentments he'd cultivated also awaited him there, culminating in the deadly confrontation. He likely never anticipated that a member of his own family would take his life, but the pattern he contributed to of anger, threats, and unresolved disputes made such a tragedy far more likely. In the simplest sense, he was someone who never truly left the fight outside the ring. He carried the mentality of combat into everyday life, battling neighbors, relatives, law enforcement, and anyone else who challenged him. He might have believed that's what a tough fighter was supposed to do, not realizing that outside the ring, that kind of combativeness only leads to isolation or prison cells. And so his life ended violently, a man who, despite once holding a major world title, is better remembered for headlines about crime, brutality, and self-destruction. When people summarize the legacy of that man, they rarely talk about a beloved champion who aged gracefully or contributed to the sport after retirement. They talk about the never-ending string of controversies, the sexual assault conviction, the deportations, the countless accusations of violence, and finally, the murder that ended his story forever. It's a dark chapter in boxing's history, a reminder that an individual can become champion of the world yet fail miserably at being a decent human being. He stands as a prime example of how success can magnify personal flaws if there's no willingness to change. The saddest part of it all is how many opportunities he had to steer his life in a better direction, and how every single time he chose hostility and lawlessness instead. The final blow in Jamaica was both shocking and strangely unsurprising. It was the last page in a narrative that had been drenched in aggression for decades. His death closed the door on any redemption arc. There would be no final apology tour, no heartfelt confession about his mistakes, no telling the younger generation to avoid the path he took. Instead, the story ended in blood and familial betrayal, leaving observers to piece together 1,000 unanswered questions. Most center on why he couldn't break free from the cycle of violence and why the nephew resorted to lethal force rather than another path. But it's too late to unravel that now. The case concluded in court, and the memory of what happened lingers as a warning. If anything endures from that tragic life, it's a stark cautionary tale about letting anger rule every decision. pride, paranoia, and an appetite for conflict can corrode the spirit just as thoroughly as any destructive habit. He had the physical gifts to excel in a demanding sport, but the moral and emotional deficits proved fatal, both literally and figuratively. Still, there are some who look deeper into his upbringing and wonder if poverty and hardship in early childhood shaped an individual who believed that aggression was the only way to secure respect. Although details of his formative years are sparse, a few acquaintances claim that he was surrounded by violence from a young age, witnessing brutal confrontations in impoverished neighborhoods. They say that once he discovered boxing, he found a way to monetize his toughness, turning the raw force he saw around him into a career. Yet that same force never seemed to have an off switch. Whatever temper he had as a child carried through into adulthood, magnified by the frustrations of dealing with promoters, managers, and personal obligations he couldn't handle. If indeed he was raised in a difficult environment, that might explain part of his worldview, but it doesn't absolve him of crimes like sexual assault. Even if there was a grain of empathy to be found in his background, it never manifested in a desire to make peace or pursue a lawful existence. There were fleeting periods when he wasn't making headlines for violence or legal disputes, and in those stretches, he might appear on a local TV program to talk about the glory days of boxing. But inevitably, a new altercation would occur, overshadowing anything positive he tried to do. Former fans found it exhausting to keep hearing about him in police reports instead of sports columns. Some of the same reporters who once praised him for his resilience in the ring wrote scathing editorials condemning his inability to follow the law. They viewed it as a betrayal of the trust placed in him by people who believed in redemption stories. Plenty of fighters had rough backgrounds but chose to channel their energy in more productive ways. He did the opposite, diving deeper into chaos until chaos took him under. The magnitude of his rape conviction cannot be overstated, as it was perhaps the darkest moment that defined his public perception. Once that crossed the line, many in the community, both boxing insiders and fans, saw no path of forgiveness. He had inflicted lifelong trauma on a minor, displaying a cruelty that no championship belt could excuse. If there had been any illusions about him simply being a feisty competitor prone to scraps, that conviction shattered them entirely. By committing one of the most despicable crimes imaginable, he placed himself beyond the pale in the eyes of many. Even some of his defenders, who believed the conspiracy theories he peddled regarding managers or unscrupulous business partners, could not stand by him after that. It was a watershed moment that isolated him from the mainstream sports world, making him persona non grata. And every new assault charge, every new deportation hearing, only reinforced the image of a man who not only refused to reform, but also doubled down on behaviors that kept him in perpetual conflict with society. Once back in Jamaica for good, his interactions with the local authorities were tense. He approached them with the same mistrust he had for police elsewhere, and they, aware of his record, offered no special treatment. Rural policing can sometimes be less formal, relying on community ties and unwritten understandings, but he had already burned bridges with neighbours and family, so there was little goodwill left. When disputes arose, local law enforcement found themselves in a bind, sometimes forced to separate him from relatives to keep fights from escalating. These were not just petty squabbles, but often involved threats or actual violence. Each incident made the next one more likely, as resentments piled up like dry kindling waiting for a spark. His nephew, who would eventually stand accused of murder, was said to have harbored a deep grudge. Some said the nephew had been physically assaulted multiple times, while others claimed the young man was simply unable to handle the older man's intimidation tactics. Either way, tensions skyrocketed in the weeks leading to that fatal encounter. On the night of his killing, the environment was ripe for a tragedy. Accounts differ on whether alcohol played a role or whether he confronted the nephew first. What's clear is that once words were exchanged, the fight turned physical almost immediately. People living nearby recalled hearing shouts and a possible struggle. By the time anyone arrived to check on the commotion, the beating was well underway or already finished. He suffered catastrophic head injuries that left him unrecognizable. There was no ambulance in time to save him. The damage was too extensive. Some said that even seasoned first responders were taken aback by the brutality of the scene. The nephew and an accomplice fled, but they were arrested shortly thereafter. The ensuing trial confirmed many of the rumors about family tensions, though the nephew's claim of self-defense did not hold up. Evidence suggested this was an act of retribution rather than an attempt to ward off an attack. In court, the nephew recounted years of alleged mistreatment and abuse, painting a picture of a man who tormented his kin. While none of that justified murder, it illustrated the toxic atmosphere that had enveloped the household. A neighbor testified that he was known for ruling by fear, while another claimed that he had threatened to cut down anyone who stood in his way. Though it's impossible to verify every statement, the pattern that emerged matched what the media had reported for years. A man consumed by anger, refusing to seek help, lashing out at those closest to him. The defense tried to evoke sympathy by describing the nephew's mental anguish, suggesting that the final attack was the explosion of long-suppressed rage. But the judge and jury saw this as premeditated, or at least an egregious escalation that ended a human life. The nephew's guilty verdict echoed the tragedies that had followed him everywhere. Violence met with violence, culminating in a total collapse of any moral boundary. When the verdict was announced, there was no celebrating. Two families, really just branches of the same extended family, were left shattered. He was gone, and the nephew was set to spend the prime of his life behind bars. News articles summarized the story as a cautionary tale about a fallen champion who allowed his demons to overshadow any vestige of hope or redemption. Yet even with the final chapter closed, the questions lingered. Could anyone have intervened earlier? Could therapy, community support, or a different mentor have directed his rage into something less destructive? Or was he simply too entrenched in that fighter's mentality, where every slight was grounds for retaliation? No one will ever know for sure. What remains is a piece of boxing history wrapped in scandal, heartbreak, and ultimately homicide. In the pantheon of troubled athletes, his name occupies a particularly grim place because of the severity of his crimes and the vicious nature of his death. He serves as a haunting example of how external success means nothing if a person's moral core and emotional health are neglected. Despite glimpses of skill in the ring, he never developed the discipline or humility needed to handle life's hurdles without resorting to threats or force. That inability to adapt, combined with his unwavering belief that everyone was out to sabotage him, sealed his fate. In the end, he could not control the violence within himself, and he could not control the violence that would ultimately be inflicted upon him. Sports documentaries sometimes devote a segment to him, usually in the context of the big names he faced. A passing reference might be made to his victory in a major bout, followed by a mention of his subsequent controversies. But these documentaries rarely linger on the specifics of his criminal history, mostly because they aim to highlight the sport's achievements rather than dwell on its disgraced figures. However, for those who dig deeper, the layers of law-breaking, aggression, and tragic consequences reveal a story that has virtually no uplifting coda. The only lesson to glean is one of warning. Raw talent is wasted without moral grounding, and brute force eventually meets a more brutal end. When all is said and done, he remains a figure who generated far more sympathy for his victims than for himself. The teenage girl he assaulted carries that trauma indefinitely, and the nephew who killed him will spend crucial years in prison. Observers might argue over the complexities of how he ended up so steeped in conflict, but they can't argue the facts. Conviction for rape, multiple assault charges, repeated deportations, and a final confrontation that left him dead in the street. That is what he left behind, and it's a legacy that no champion's belt can wash away. In the final analysis, Trevor Berbick's name is less about sports glory and more about a harrowing narrative of legal troubles, crimes, and self-inflicted misery. Yes, he once ascended to the top of the heavyweight division, albeit briefly. But his real legacy lies in court documents and cautionary headlines. He might have knocked out a few challengers during his prime, but he never knocked out the anger that ruled him from within. And in the end, that anger proved far more potent than any punch he ever threw in the ring. Some mental health professionals who examine cases like his note that chronic traumatic encephalopathy might have played a role in his destructive spiral. That condition, often referred to as CTE, can arise from repeated blows to the head and may lead to impulsivity, aggression, and volatile moods. If he was indeed suffering from a brain injury, that might shed light on his constant readiness to fight and his inability to regulate his emotions. Yet even a neurological explanation would not absolve him of the crimes he committed. It would only add another layer to a tragic picture. An athlete grappling with internal damage he never fully understood or addressed. Without a formal diagnosis, all anyone can do is speculate. Family members, prosecutors, and journalists alike never received any official confirmation that he had such a condition. When people recall his perpetual anger, his unrelenting suspicion of others, and the shocking violence that followed him everywhere, they often wonder if his brain had simply been battered beyond repair. There is also a conversation to be had about whether the culture of boxing and combat sports fosters a mentality that encourages participants to see themselves as warriors at all times. Plenty of boxers, of course, manage to separate their ring persona from daily life, recognizing that the aggression which serves them in competition must be checked outside it. Unfortunately, he did not seem capable of making that distinction. From his earliest days on the professional circuit, he viewed every slight, real or imagined, as a direct challenge to his pride. That worldview intensified with each success and failure, leaving him with a constant chip on his shoulder. The result was a life story dominated by police reports, restraining orders, parole violations, and finally, a gruesome murder scene that closed the book on any hope of a peaceful retirement. Even after all these years, discussions about him rarely center on questions of how good he could have been in the ring. Instead, they focus on the tragic downfall and the unbroken chain of antisocial behaviors that ruined his life. Some voices insist that he was once misunderstood, that certain allegations were blown out of proportion, and that the media had a hand in amplifying his mistakes. Others maintain that the documented evidence and court verdicts speak loudest, showing a pattern of hostility that can't be excused or explained away by media hype. Whichever view one takes, his saga remains one of boxing's most disturbing cautionary tales, a raw demonstration of how unchecked rage and criminal acts can strip a man of everything, including his life. By the time his story ended on that blood-stained ground in Jamaica, it was apparent that any chance for redemption had long since slipped away.